Welcome to Current Affairs. My name is Nathan Robinson. I am the editor-in-chief of Current Affairs magazine. I am joined today by comedian and writer Danny Katch. He is the author of the book Socialism Seriously, a brief guide to human liberation, available from the wonderful Haymarket Books. Danny Katch, welcome to Current Affairs.
Thank you. Very happy to be here.
All right, so Socialism Seriously. You begin early in your book. You've got something I think is delightful, which is that you rewrite the opening passage of the Communist Manifesto for the contemporary era. An excerpt from your book was adapted recently for Jacobin, and you included this in there too. And so why don't we start with that? Because you show us, obviously the Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels wrote one of the enduring classic texts of socialism, but they wrote it about the world of the mid-19th century. And your point in writing this updated version in modern language about the contemporary United States is, I take it, that it has enduring relevance.
Yep, that's definitely something I wanted to get across. And I think one hope that I had in the book, it's not the only one. I mean, obviously the primary hope is fame and fortune for myself,
of course,
regardless of what happens.
Yes, which leftist literature is famously the root.
Totally, no, I chose very well. But yeah, I want to both talk about socialism in a way that is accessible, and you don't need to know references to 19th century Germany and 20th century Russia to understand it. But I also really value the writings of Karl Marx and Rosa Luxemburg. And I wanted to, I don't think people, when they read my book, they have to go read that stuff. But I wanted to create a bit of a bridge to give people a sense who are coming or questioning socialism to the idea that, like, people have been thinking about this stuff for a while. And reading that opening lines of the manifesto about how a specter is haunting Europe, it's all about, it really is the 1848 version of panicked Republican governors warning about the evils of socialism, and then kind of sell out Democrats in turn to, throwing socialists under the bus, like all those Democrats that signed on to that resolution in the House condemning socialism.
Right.
And the book just begins with this brilliant, people are all talking about this boogeyman. It's time for the actual socialist or communist. And we can get back to that question about how much there's a distinction there. It's time for us to actually say who we really are and what our aims are.
Well, just to give our listeners a bit of a taste of what you do here, I'll just read a little excerpt from it. You say, a ghost is haunting the United States, the ghost of socialism. All kinds of elites and defenders of the status quo stand united against this demon. Presidents and megachurch preachers, Fox News hosts and Facebook censors, Wall Street CEOs and local sheriffs. Can you name a single Republican who doesn't accuse their Democratic opponent of being part of an evil socialist conspiracy? How many Democrats don't respond by throwing socialists under the bus? This means two things. The rich and powerful can see that socialism is a real threat to their way of life, and now is the time for socialists to let the people know our real beliefs, goals, and strategies, and replace these childish ghost stories with a clear explanation of the better world we're fighting for. And I didn't notice when I read that, the trick, which is that it is the Communist Manifesto updated. I just thought, well, that's a really good, clear explanation. And then you give us what Marx said, which is the same thing. A specter is haunting Europe, the specter of communism. All the powers have entered into a holy alliance to exorcise Pope and Tsar, Metternich and Guizot. Where is the party in opposition that has not been decried as communistic? And I just love that, because I didn't notice it at first, and then so the fact that you don't notice it really makes clear that it could be written today.
Totally. So I shamelessly, it's very hard to write a gripping opening to your book. So I totally steal it from Marx and Engels, but as I know, we're comrades. You know what I mean? I'm sure they'd be cool with it.
Yeah, it's true. No. I agree. It belongs to the public, belongs to us all, as any good socialist should believe. Now, early in your book, you respond to people's obvious questions, which is, and I got this too, because I read a book about why you should be a socialist. And the first thing, I knew people would go like, okay, but what do you mean by socialism? And I was like, I really don't like the definitional questions, because people answer it in lots of ways. And obviously it's a very rich and complex political tradition with many different tendencies, and they all fight each other. But you have a really nice one in terms of how getting it down to a little pithy phrase. You say Socialism is a society whose top priority is meeting all of its people's needs, ranging from food, shelter, and health care to art, culture, and companionship. In contrast, capitalism only cares about any of that basic human necessity stuff to the extent that money can be made off it. So can you tell us a little bit about, why, in thinking about how you'd first present socialism, you decided to present this particular kind of brief definition?
Yeah, right. And I'm sure you know that when you do try to offer a brief answer to what it, on the one hand, people rightfully so always want to know, okay, so you're a socialist, you do all this writing, so tell me what is it and give me the quick version. And then, of course, when you try to do that, sometimes those same people, definitely others, will come back at you being like, but you didn't talk about this, you didn't talk about that. I have a bunch of videos out that are, like little 2-minute explainers on different socialist questions. And I definitely got some of that. And it's like, well, it is a 2-minute video, but, and I think I offer different definitions of socialism as the book goes on, as I think anybody would have to. But I think that's a starting point, because if you think about the words socialism and capitalism, social versus capital, right? I mean, like a society governed by the needs of capital versus a society governed by social forces, the needs of society. To me, that's as good a starting point as any, but I guess probably more importantly is that it's trying to label things in a pretty straightforward to understand way that resonates with the way we live our lives, or the way we don't get to live our lives.
Well, the reason I liked it so much is that, first, the one small thing I like about it is that you put art, culture, and companionship as part of people's needs. You emphasize that, we're about, that socialists believe in a rich experience and existence, and that it's the roses as well as the bread. But what I thought was so good about that as an entry point is where you say capitalism only cares about that stuff to the extent that money can be made off of it. I think that is such an important point, because it's not that capitalism never provides food, right? You can go to the grocery store. It's not that capitalism never provides any kind of shelter. You can rent an apartment. It is that it provides it to the extent that money can be made off it. And the moment those human imperatives of the basic needs conflict with the money being made, the money will come above the basic needs. And because there are so many points in which the interests of capital diverge from the interests of society as a whole, those basic needs often don't get met. But sometimes they do. And this is, I think, what's so good about that definition, is that you help us think, okay, well, there are two ways in which we could go about pursuing those basic needs. We could do it as a route to making money, or we could do it as an end in itself.
No, that's right. And I think also because capitalism, right, if we lived in a world where capitalism didn't have any avenue for meeting those needs, I mean, it would be, I hope this is my only reference to the Matrix in this interview. It's not like, but it would be like, in the Matrix, they talked about it first, the first experiment, you know what I mean, where it didn't, actually that experiment didn't work because things were too perfect. But the basic idea is that capitalism needs us. It needs us as workers. It needs us as workers in all the capacities, raising the next generation of children, doing work. Our needs have to be at least inadequately met for the majority of us. In capitalism, the drive for profit and extracting as much as possible gets them into trouble sometimes, because, their greed actually gets them to the point where they're not even meeting enough of our needs to even, to even function. And that's not even a new problem. You go back, we mentioned Karl Marx and Engels. You go back to the dawn of industrial capitalism in the 1800s, and there's crises happening because capitalism is running the working class into the ground and not even allowing the conditions to exist where people can raise the next generation of workers. And there's these different chapters, in these struggles that happen. But so, yeah, and I think then people will turn around, defenders of capitalism. This is sort of the old, like, oh, but you use an ATM, don't you? And you call yourself a social, people will point to any form of our needs being met under capitalism as somehow evidence that this is a superior system or the only possible way that those needs can be met. So, no, I do think it's important to put out those two paths.
And another thing I like about what you do, because you take a kind of Marxist approach here is a lot of free market libertarians will do this thing where they point to all of the incredible things produced under capitalism as evidence that it works. And they'll go, look at all this abundance, look at all the expansion of our productive powers. But of course, you take us back to the Communist Manifesto where Marx is like, yes, of course. That's what I'm saying. I'm saying that capitalism expands the productive powers, but also that it's an insane and ultimately self-destructive system. And so all of the libertarian defense that points to the many wonderful things capitalism produces is not really an argument against a Marxist perspective that says that, yes, but it's a stage in history that we need to get past, and then we need to share that abundance that it has produced.
No, and I think, and by the way, that's where I think the Marxist tradition is having lots of conversations about, well, how much do we say that still completely applies when we're facing ecologically, do we face the need to not continually expand? I think a lot of the Marxist tradition for a long time was able to see that in an uncomplicated way, right? Capitalism has brought this level of production and then socialism takes it to the next level. A couple things complicate that. One, the question of how much of that happened through enslavement, colonialism, all sorts of other things. And, some Marxists have definitely fallen into the trap, including early Marx, not so much late Marx, of being like, well, that sucks, but I guess that's part of the historical process or whatever, which is one thing when you're standing on one continent and another thing when you're standing on another continent in that process. But I think also the question of to what degree is socialism going to be able to take the expansive capacities of capitalism and say, now we're just going to finally make this more rational by making it actually democratic and putting it under collective control? Or to what degree is there going to be, that is still somewhat true, but also, and the fact that it's in the age of capitalism that many technological developments happen, right? There are libertarians who act like, socialists don't get to then build on those achievements, that we have to sort of return them to like the checkout counter of history, as if like that's ever happened. All stages of history build on each other. But I do think it is, those questions of growth are real. There's another quote I have in the book from Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations, which I find interesting because it doesn't sound very libertarian either. And to make no mistake, Adam Smith talked about the invisible hand and the free market and all that stuff. But some of his appreciation at the dawn of capitalism, when he's sort of seeing the rise of industrialism, is for how it brings people together, yes, in market relations, but he writes a lot about the sort of beautiful cooperation around the world of all the different things that it takes to produce a coat and then have it be sold on the market. He is very much not talking about the enslavement of people and things. There's many things he's not talking about, but it is also interesting that even the person who I think these days is considered by many the patron saint of individualism and greed was actually attracted to some of the aspects of capitalism that build relationships with people, in different places through the market in ways that can be changed. And it just shows among some of the early intellectuals saying, hey, this capitalism thing can work a lot better than the king's ministers deciding our economy. There is a humanism there, at least, that I think that is completely absent in today's anti-society libertarian types.
Right. So Adam Smith is often cited by those anti-society libertarian types for that one quote about how the butcher and the baker don't give you stuff because they like you, but because they're, of their own self-interest. And that's used as a kind of justification in constructing, you're heavily critical of social Darwinism in the book. And this social Darwinist idea that, the rational individual goes out to maximize everything for themselves, and the pursuit of this war of all against all will ultimately somehow end up in the benefit everybody, because if we all pursue our self-interest, Adam Smith's butcher and baker thing will apply, and then everyone will get. But as you point out, Smith is actually very complicated, and you said there, he's also talking about how do you build institutions where lots of people from around the world can cooperate in order to achieve the best ends for society. And in fact, social Darwinism, as you point out in here, has been this very, very pernicious but very kind of powerful myth, in part because it draws on Darwinism, it draws on scientific Darwinism to suggest that the natural state of human beings is this competitive war of all against all.
Yeah, and it's complicated because it draws on Darwinism and it doesn't at the same time, right? But first of all, to the extent that it does draw on Darwinism, Charles Darwin, scientists don't come to their ideas simply in a laboratory or, in Charles Darwin's case, on the Beagle sailing around the world. They can't help but view whatever they're studying through the lens of their understanding in their world they live. So is it that surprising that an English person in the late 1800s is going to see the workings of nature in a way that reflects the brutal capitalism of 19th century England? So the fact that you have Darwin in part viewing what he's studying on the Galapagos Islands inevitably through the lens of his society, just the way that our metaphors for the brain change with, now we think about it as computers, we can't help but doing this. Darwin of course, can't help seeing metaphors of capitalism in what he's observing in animals. And that's going to completely inform his theory of evolution. So the fact that capitalism influences the theory of evolution doesn't really make it proof then that the theory of evolution justifies capitalism. But beyond that, Darwin himself was incredibly critical of what became known as social Darwinism. He did not want his name attached at all to the idea that the poor should be left, to their own devices. He thought that was a complete misapplication of his ideas. And one of the things that I talk about in the book is that part of what's so silly, although I completely agree with you that it's very powerful, it has a powerful hold, partly because we live in a, quote, dog-eat-dog society. And so in the same way that Darwin is going to view nature through the workings of his society, people growing up in this society, that you hear the ideas of social Darwinism, and it's going to resonate with a lot of people. Charles Darwin's theories of evolution are about, the word evolution means change, and it's all about how throughout history, species and ecosystems change. And yet social Darwinism is saying any attempt to alter the economic laws of free market capitalism are doomed to fail, because the only thing that's unchanging in this world that can't evolve is capitalism, And so if you're really going to talk about evolution a lot, you have to be able to say, oh, so that means something's going to follow capitalism.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point, because we've talked a lot on this program about right-wing arguments and how they work, and how often so many of them are some variation on nothing can be changed. If you try to change anything, you'll fail. You'll only make things worse. You'll produce a dystopia and a dictatorship and a disaster. So you have to accept things as they are. And as you've noted there have always been socialist Darwinists from Peter Kropotkin onwards who have pointed out that this understanding of evolution as it occurs in nature is just wrong. You say, let me just quote you here, you say evolutionary theory holds that species are constantly in the process of changing to better adapt to their environment, which itself is also constantly changing, whereas social Darwinists proclaim that nature favors the strong over the weak, and therefore the gross inequality of capitalism can never be changed. Perhaps you could tell us a little more about the place of this idea of, well, I've never liked the word dialectics, but a lot of socialists do. The place of these ideas of change and flux in socialism.
So, I by the way, I'd be curious to hear more your opinion of dialectics. I'm someone who, I grew up politically in a tradition that loved the word dialectics, and I'm cool with it. I've definitely heard it misused more than I've heard it maybe. So sometimes I think it just is a word people throw around to just mean like shit's complex, or you know what I mean, like more than one thing is true at the same time, or whatever. And so I've never really had much of a philosophical bent myself, so it's not something I dive into too much. But to me, the idea, whether we want to call it dialectics or not, but that there's all sorts of competing and conflicting forces under the surface of things that are not always apparent to the eye. You know what I mean? So classic examples are, well, let me let me not talk myself into a corner here. But the idea that and so the way that applies to a society that's riven with class conflict is, people often look to these kind of ideas to make sense of how, in moments when it feels like I don't see how a substantially different kind of society is possible, because you look around and we're living in a society where it's looking like, what is it going to be, Joe Biden versus Donald Trump again in 2024. And so, from a certain kind of linear way of thinking about it, if seemingly the most left-wing alternative that the majority of people in this country are willing to tolerate is Joe Biden, then ergo something as radical as socialism is simply impossible in the short and medium term. By the way, I think socialism is also impossible in the short and medium term, simply because it's not something that happens with a snap of a finger, but not for that reason, right? So we understanding that underneath the seemingly centrist to far right-wing surface of a political system that produces Joe Biden versus Donald Trump are seething class tensions, movements for racial justice, fury at the overturning of abortion, and a radicalization among young people around questions of gender that is completely being not reflected in terms of the laws happening on the states. That gives you a different then vision of how sometimes those tensions can come bursting forth in the surface and produce something very different.
I don't think I consider myself a Marxist, but one of the things I respect about Marx and the Marxist tradition is that it involves a lot of examination of history and how things have radically changed at various points over the course of history and why they have changed. Because as you've suggested, it's easy to, because we're each sort of born fresh into the world, it's easy to look around us and see the society we live in and see the snapshot that is the brief span of our life as, well, that's society. That's what it is. But then when you start to study history and you start to see revolutions and you start to see the displacement of one kind of economic and social structure with another one, and you start to see the crumbling of various hierarchies. We had Adolph Reed on the show a couple of months ago, and he was talking about the collapse of the Jim Crow order here in New Orleans and how suddenly it vanished. And it had seemed when he was growing up as a child like the Jim Crow order was the social order. That was the society. That was the hierarchy. And then within like 15 years, the whole thing just completely turned out to be, as he said, very brittle. And you gave it a shove and the whole thing gave way.
Right. You mentioned that. I've been thinking a lot lately about, I'm saying surprising, of course it's not surprising, but just how striking it is that in this country, people are familiar on a surface level with the movement that ended Jim Crow, and 100 years before that, the Civil War / revolution that ended slavery, right? And yet most of us, at times myself included, and including oftentimes much of the left, really don't walk around with a sense of that history belonging to us, that history being things that we can draw on. None of which is to say that you just replicate everything that was done 60 years ago or 100. Of course not. But that lack of history, which, definitely the Marxist tradition can emphasize it, but there's, many other, simply belonging to various political schools of thought and tradition is so valuable, in part because usually, with the exception of liberalism maybe, which we should talk about, but usually it gives you some sense of history and belonging to something larger and deeper than your current moment. And that, I feel like, is, and by the way, psychologically, if there's listeners who are like, ugh, I don't want to have to watch videos and read about history, it really helps you deal with the existential despair that all of us feel sometimes, knowing that there's many reasons to be very frightened about the growing right, about climate change or whatever, but having some sense that the world is larger than the morning that you just woke up into today it really does ground you.
I think that's very profound. And I had a similar feeling when I was confronting in writing my socialism book this question that I'm sure you did too, which is you will get people going, okay, but why call yourself a socialist. You quote Norman Thomas saying, well, Americans would just accept all of the things socialists want if you just called it liberalism. And you point out that, in fact, it works the kind of the opposite way, in that socialists can end up doing all of the liberal things while calling themselves socialists and not notice that they're abandoning all the core tenets of socialism. But I dealt with this question, well, why call yourself a socialist? And one of the answers that I came up with, that I was persuaded by, was that it grounds you in this tradition of these people who have fought for the same things that I believe in. You go back in history, and the people that are doing the things that I think were the things that needed to be done, people like Eugene Debs, people like A. Philip Randolph, people like Martin Luther King, they were all socialists, and they call themselves socialists. So when I call myself a socialist, I am grounding myself. I am trying to, I'm not saying I am the same as them or equivalent to them, but I am trying to pick up the project that they were committed to in generations before.
Absolutely. No, and I gain more appreciation for that as time goes on. And it is so important to claim Martin Luther King. Maybe claim is the wrong word, especially as I'm a white person, but to proudly talk about King's socialism, about his political training, which, by the way, at the time, all the white supremacists were screaming from the rooftops about him being a communist and all that, which, you know, is obviously some of that was a tactic, which we very much see still in effect today, but some of it was true. Like, there was a radical socialist and communist tradition that was scattered and pulverized by the McCarthyism in the 50s, but, you know, it still managed to have networks that really helped contribute to the civil rights movement. What you're saying really resonates with me there. And to me, that's where, you know, I mentioned liberalism before. I think, you know, on the one hand, and I think liberalism is really important because many of us, not all of us, but many people who become socialists come from being liberals. You know, I certainly did. I think if it can be a default understanding, I think this is wrong, I think that's wrong, but hey, I'm not saying like capitalism itself is a problem. You know, that seems quite impractical to talk about getting rid of capitalism. And to find viewpoint as a starting point, there's, you know, many more liberals out there than socialists who are very important parts of movements, but sort of as an institutional force, I do feel like liberalism, because it really helps contribute to an anti-history. You know what I mean? Because there's sort of this constant state of liberal shock at how bad things are that I think partly comes from, you have to keep upholding this, you know, this idea that like, well, this is not American. And it's like, no. This is very American. You know what I mean? Like, part of the history of the Debses and the Randolphs and the Kings, you know what I mean, is understanding like, we've been fighting this for a long time, and there's been ups and downs, and we can learn things from those struggles, as opposed to constantly feeling like, I can't believe this is happening. I can't believe this is happening. What's gone wrong? Maybe it's Putin's secret agents. Maybe it's the internet has rotted, you know, has just spread fake news, and you know what I mean, et cetera, et cetera. And so it's, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the nice things about Marx, is the effort to give a persuasive explanation for why certain things are happening, why the world looks the way it does. I am skeptical of the ability to create scientific theories of the way that society works, because society is so complicated. But it's true that when you start to understand how a capitalist firm works, you can better predict the behavior of your boss. You can better predict, when you start to understand, you know, how economic power works, you can start to see why the US Congress works the way it does, why it's so difficult to get Medicare for all passed. Things start to click into place and make sense for you when you start to adopt a socialist understanding of the way the world works.
Yeah, no, and I think it's funny because it might be interesting for us to talk about like what Marxism means to you, what it means to me. I personally don't have that much of a stake in saying, oh, the socialist movement needs to identify itself as Marxist or else it's doomed or something. But I agree. Like, Marx came of age at the height of scientific prestige, right? And so the idea of casting your ideas as a scientific analysis of society, not that there's anything wrong with science, of course, but that there are observable and laws of history that, just like laws of physics, can be analyzed, et cetera, is certainly something that in lesser hands than Marx certainly can become, frankly, just kind of ridiculous in terms of, and I mentioned before liberals having a weakness for constantly being surprised at everything and shocked. I think there's the radical tradition, Marxist and otherwise, can have the opposite vice, which is constantly acting like we're not surprised by anything. You know what I mean?
I get this in every time I express outrage about something on social media, there's a bunch of people leftists reply going, "Oh, and this surprises you?"
Thank you. That's great. That really contributed so much. And look, I try to be. All of us who are on the left, man, we deserve a lot. You know what I mean? Like, it's not easy. And I think it's sort of like a self-defense mechanism against the vulnerability that we all have and all that. But yeah, no. There's a lot of stuff that's surprising. And if you've gone through the last few years being like, oh, I'm not surprised, COVID, you know what I mean? Like, blah, 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 like, okay. But that being said, to me, when I see, I guess, my own evolving sense of like, why would I identify myself as a Marxist, right? You know what I mean? It's certainly not because I think that the working class is destined to triumph, you know what I mean? Which at times Marx can
due to the laws of history.
Right, due to the laws of history. But I guess what I do see in a Marxist method and a Marxist approach, which, maybe this isn't really unique to Marxism or whatever, but I think some of his and other people's sort of best writings do that, is this attempt to marry, trying to have an objective, to analyze society and realize that there's forces of history that are way beyond, not laws of history, but larger forces that you got to analyze and just figure out what role can you, by you, I mean, the forces that you're trying to build, play. And to marry kind of the morality and the willpower of the movement we're trying to build with an understanding that at different moments in history that we can do our best to try to wrap our heads around, different things are possible. You know what I mean? Like, there's moments when possibly widespread revolutionary change are possible. There's moments when, hey, that is not happening at all. And if that's your goal, you're actually going to crash against the rocks and do more harm to your movement than you can help. Now, what those are, I mean, that's, of course, what we're always debating. And that's the evergreen importance of trying to build movements that know how to argue within each other without destroying each other. And,
yes.
Which is we're not particularly good at, but but to me, I don't talk about the scientific socialism very much, but something about that understanding of the marriage of analysis and the idea that, but also there's things that may not seem possible, maybe on a small level, but you put some people into motion and then you suddenly see what can happen and then you take it from there.
Now, let me ask you, you mentioned earlier in the conversation that you used to have a kind of liberal analysis and then you developed a more socialist analysis. When you encounter someone who is where you used to be ideologically, I mean, your book is an effort to introduce socialism in an accessible and compelling way, especially to those who don't necessarily hold socialist beliefs yet. So if you meet someone and they say, well, yes, they say this thing where I share your concerns about inequality and, I agree that the concentration of wealth is far too great in our society. But when you start talking about capitalism and superseding capitalism itself, well, that seems unrealistic, and I'm not with you at all on that. We can have sensible political reforms that are going to ameliorate the worst of capitalism. Where do you begin to talk to such a person about why you think they should be a little more radical?
Almost inevitably, I don't have a go-to point. I'm going to ask more questions, and some of the questions I'm going to ask are, so what, how do you think we move forward? Or what, tell me what you think. And not there's a way you can quote unquote ask questions that's actually kind of being a dick, where you're basically saying like, I want you to have a fully spelled out theory of change, and I do, and therefore if you do, what I mean? Like, so there's ways of being like kind of aggressive about it, but I don't mean like that at all. I mean, trying to have an open-ended conversation where, and I can get to the sort of different points I have about this, about socialism, but usually what I'm usually looking to do in those kind of conversations is I'm trying to find the points we have of agreement. And I don't mean on a superficial level, like, hey, we both like the Mets. That's cool. Like, we're both human. I mean, in the you were talking about what are those things that the person thinks are messed up? What are their frustrations about why we can't have universal health care? Whatever it is, that's probably a pretty likely thing. And then trying to find with that person some of maybe the contradictions in their own thinking, right? Which sometimes is the contradiction between someone's lived experience and the ideology of the society we grow up in, right? You know what I mean? So you kind of scratch the surface a little bit of like, well, I don't think we can go beyond capitalism, and it's sort of, and I'm getting a little hypothetical here, but you kind of pursue their own thinking about it, because I find in general I can have a lot of facts at my disposal. I almost never find facts to be that persuasive, and I don't mean that in a condescending way, like your average person, they don't like facts. And no, I think that's true of myself as well. I think that's true of almost all of us.
I agree with you on this incident, and I don't use statistics very much either. I think that thought experiments and hypotheticals are like a lot more powerful. Like, so for example, in your book, you say it's impossible to have a society with vast economic inequality that does not also have vast political inequality. You can have billionaires or you can have democracy, but you can't have a lot of both. And I think like that, for example, is quite a powerful. It's a theoretical thing rather than a factual thing. You're not like listing all of the ways in which insurance companies successfully pressured people in Congress to not sign on to single payer. What you're doing is you're saying, okay, well, you person who believes that capitalism can be fixed, do you believe there should be billionaires? And if you believe there should be billionaires, can we talk about the way in which wealth functions as power? And how is a society going to function with those kinds of giant power differentials between someone who has, like, if the market is a place where you vote with your dollars, like one person gets 1 billion votes and one person gets no votes.
I very much agree with that. The other thing, as you're talking, something that's making me think about is that there's another, I think later in the book, I have another definition of socialism. This kind of comes back to the very beginning of what we were talking about, where I'm not going to hit, I wouldn't hit readers up with that right away, but I talk about socialism, among other things, being a phase of history that we haven't yet entered. And that can sound a little cosmic or whatever, but to me, the idea being that one of the objections people have to socialism, and I don't mean everybody, I don't mean Ron DeSantis, I mean the people we care about, right? The people that are, in every sense of the word, but also the people who are winnable, you know what I mean, to being socialist in the short term and in the medium term. One of the biggest objections is simply the uncertainty, the fear, right? Sticking with the devil we know of the laws of private property than something we don't, which, and there's the uncertainty of whether different kinds of socialism could quote unquote work. There's also, of course, the uncertainty of like, the backlash and the reaction it'll face. And I say that because I think there's different arguments that are persuasive to different people, but there's also no getting around the growing dread, you know what I mean? Particularly around climate change, increasingly about I would say primarily about climate change, but it takes different forms, and you see it then reflected. The right wing is wonderful at then projecting existential dread onto trans fucking children, or migrant children.
They're what's going to bring down society,
right? But they're able to sort of jujitsu it. There's an actual dread that they get to mold and shape that they didn't create. You know what I mean? And that they're using very well. We have the harder but also more straightforward task of being more honest about where the dread is, but not in that way where it's like, let's shout at the rooftops about how scary, if we don't get rid of capitalism in the next 20 years, this is what's going to happen with the oceans. I think we all know that doesn't really motivate people, but that idea of explaining, while we're talking about all the ways that socialism is more rational, all the ways that policy, starting points like Medicare for all, free childcare or whatever, where that can get you, we also have to develop an ability to build trust and honesty that socialists talk about how, we don't totally know. Like, you don't know until you get there what everything looks like and is going to be. I've learned a lot from reading, Mariam Kaba, the abolitionist, who writes about this a lot when it talks about police defunding and abolition. And I find her words really straightforward about people. Well, what do we do without police? And, people could have different opinions about this, but she writes a lot about how it's a lot about in the local experiments with reducing police and building alternatives that we learn more about what the next step is going to look like. You know what I mean? And that's not great for winning elections. You know what I mean? Like, that's not great for talking points because it's not reassuring, and it's not the only way at all that I would talk about socialism. But I think it has to be a component that, like, I'm not going to be able to allay all of your fears about what does it look like if we have a society that isn't governed by private property, the profit motive or whatever. But look at where we're fucking heading right now,
I will say, though, to people who may think that you're dodging the question, well, what would functional socialism actually look like, that in the book you do engage in one of my own favorite exercises, which is engaging in utopian fiction about what the life in the socialist society would look like. And you choose life on a bad day in the socialist society, which I like, because we have to do this combination, I think, of things of, yes, saying that, look, you build a society through experience and experimentation, and you discard what's not working. You can't just plan it out all ahead of time, but also we have to engage in those imaginative exercises where we try and give people an understanding of, well, this is one way in which that it might look, so that it doesn't just sound like some abstraction.
Yeah, I mean, I end up doing 2 chapters like that because I'm glad you brought it up. I find that so useful. I think one of the chapters takes place in, what used to be an Amazon warehouse, right? Where, and it helps you to envision how much of the sort of distribution and logistics and technology, if it was under democratic ownership, what would it look like if these famous algorithms, Amazon had, were actually were public and were subject to regular tweaking by committees of the workers and consumers and others, you know what I mean? Where it's like, like last month, the production schedule was, it helped deliver this thing to this neighborhood, but workers are complaining about that. There's things that just a little bit of imagination. We know we're not about to win that in Amazon, but it really can help you think about, oh my God, like so much of this just tweaked 10 degrees could look so different.
It doesn't have to be this way.
Right.
That's such an important thing to a better world is possible, as we like to say. Now you note that in some ways, socialists over the last decade have some victories. You point out how a lot of people in my generation certainly were radicalized by the financial crisis in the United States, bailing out of banks, and then the election of Barack Obama on a platform of change, and then the absence of any ensuing change. You have a great quote from Terry Eagleton, who says capitalism is in trouble just when people start talking about capitalism, because it ceases to be as natural as the air we breathe, and it can be seen as a historical and rather recent phenomenon. And so there's been a flourishing of socialist media and books, and anti-capitalist critiques have made their way into film and television. At the same time, socialists have had a lot of disappointment. Bernie Sanders ran for president twice as Democratic Socialist. A lot of us got very excited, and he didn't win. Now Joe Biden is the president, and you mentioned that we've got a choice, seemingly, we're going to have between Joe Biden and Donald Trump. So I conclude with you here, Danny Katch, by asking you, for socialists today who have come to share your analysis in the book, but feel a sense of political disappointment, feel that dread, and are looking for some words to help them in their resolution and determination, where do we go from here?
Well, I mean, other than I've generally found people have told me that when they buy multiple copies of my book, it just gives them a stronger sense of direction.
I think the more you buy, I think there's no upper limit.
Strange. I don't know why. I believe me.
100 books makes you 100 times more socialist. So
yeah. So again, that's getting back to like this is still trying to make the leftist writer thing work. Look, I don't totally know. You know what I mean? And this book doesn't get a lot into strategy. And I mean, I'm going to come back to your question, but I really try to also lay out, here's some of the debates the socialists have. And I write it from a tone of voice where, the imagined reader is someone who is not yet a socialist or is thinking about being a socialist. I think people who are already socialists find it useful, but it's sort of written with this tone of like, so here are some of the debates we have. The more of you who join us and bring in your ideas, you're going to help us figure this out, right? And that's sort of my way of like, for many of the kind of fork in the road questions that we're facing, being like, yeah, like that's, that this book isn't going to take a stand on it. I do think that the fact that, and I was skeptical of Bernie running as a Democrat in 2016. And I was, and really saw that some of the things that I thought that would be weakness about that didn't come to pass. You know what I mean? And was much more on board with the potential he had in 2020. The fact that the electoral momentum on the left, which is the most recent kind of expression of the radicalization, has stalled out from the major momentum it had, which isn't to say, I mean, it's not completely stalled out. Brandon Johnson just won, just became mayor of Chicago. There's clearly still things happening, but I think most people understand now, like, oh, this is not just going to be up and away, a series of victories or even something like that. It doesn't mean that all that was useless. It doesn't mean, but we're definitely in a phase now where it's like, okay, how do we consolidate some of the gains in terms of there being more socialist, there being wider support for a number of left-wing policies? What does it mean to consolidate that and move on? I don't totally know. I think for people who are socialists and who aren't part of networks or organizations, getting involved in some kinds of organizations along with other people that don't just exist via social media is incredibly important. That's how we retain our numbers and weather the ups and downs. But yeah, beyond that, I think that the questions of how we're confronting far right attacks in various ways, in ways that don't just defend ourselves, but are heightening what we stand for instead. You know what I mean? Like a left that's able to show that it knows how to defend trans people, drag shows, comrades in states with horrible right-wing governors. I think it's not only the moral thing to do, but I think it can expose what it's still at this point is a bit of a hyper online braggadocious aspect of the far right before it becomes actually more fully formed. So that's sort of highly specific, but I do think that these things that are only going to get worse as Republicans are out-dueling each other for the nomination aren't just things that the left can ignore while we build our own thing. Even though I know there's ways in terms of the online shit that we absolutely should ignore it. It shouldn't just be guided by here's the latest provocation from Texas or Florida or Missouri or whatever, and we just have to respond to that. But I think actually showing in practice what building solidarity means and the kind of joy and different kind of community that we build is very important.
Yeah, it was so easy when Bernie was running because it was so obvious for socialists. We could go, oh, well, this is the thing we can get behind. So we have an obvious. But now a lot of us are asking, well, okay, well, what do we do in this particular moment? One of the things I really like about your book is that you explore the question of how do you operate. There's always been this tension among socialists, the reformists and the revolutionaries, and how can you be a revolutionary and also, push for necessary reforms. And so unfortunately, we have run out of time, but that's precisely why people should pick up as many copies of it as they can of Socialism.
Well done.
Seriously, available from Haymarket Books, fantastic publisher that we love very much, and they can follow Danny Katch at Danush Katch. That's DANUSH Katch, KATCH, on Twitter. Danny Katch, thank you so much for joining us on Current Affairs today.
That was great. Thank you.
The Current Affairs Podcast is a product of Current Affairs Magazine. If you are not subscribed to Current Affairs Magazine, visit currentaffairs.org/subscribe today and get our glorious print edition. The Current Affairs Podcast is released regularly every week on patreon.com/currentaffairs. Thanks for listening.